Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
The end of an era, the decline and fall of the Tory party. During nearly 2 decades in the adrenaline-filled, egotistical and stressful world of Parliament, Mark Field had a remarkable capacity for getting into high-profile scrapes, including his role in the Piggate scandal and a skirmish with protesters at Mansion House. He's put it all down in a book, which is absolutely brilliant. And I'm delighted to say that the author of End of an Era, Mark Field, joins me live on the line now. Good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning to you, John. Listen, I'd much prefer to have talked about football, actually. As someone who is a Spurs fan, I have a soft spot for Arsenal tonight with the game against Real Madrid. But we had a house for many years, actually, in Mallorca. So obviously I've been very impressed to see Real Mallorca's form in the La Liga this year.
Good grief, sir.
You're rather better than they've done before.
You're on your game there, indeed. I've got a very good friend of mine is a Spurs fan, and he has a mug for his morning coffee, and he says, "I'm a Spurs fan, and this is the only cup we'll be lifting this season." So therefore, it's an existential thing being a Spurs fan, isn't it, Mark?
I'm afraid it is a little bit. I'll be there on Easter Monday against Nottingham Forest. So we hope springs eternal for footballers the world over.
Well,
but obviously, it's as exciting a world as politics was for me for all those years. So
yeah, well, hope springs eternal, Mark. And I do a phone-in show called Viewpoint, where we discuss the issues of the day with a panel of invited guests. And I have been ridiculed because I used to say, I'd say that I'm conservative with a small c, one nation Tory and all that. And apart from the skirmishes, where people will go, oh yes, they remember this, that, the Liz Truss, etc., etc. But there is a serious point to this book, isn't there, Mark?
Yeah, well, there is, and it's nice you point that out. And I'm obviously still very much a conservative. I was from an early stage. I've just turned 60, and so the book really is about my life and times. And one of the aspects, obviously, is what life was like in the 1970s, growing up in that era. And there has been that sense through much of us in the West that we're heading in that sort of direction again, with some of the same problems that don't seem to have been solved. And as I am just a baby boomer, having turned 60 in October last year, one of the lamentable things, and I say it as a father of 2 teenagers, is what a mess we've left. I grew up at a time when there was peace in our time. You wouldn't have to go to war. There wasn't debt. I went to university. It was first in my family to go to university, but came out without debt, got onto the housing ladder. And I suspect many of your listeners, particularly out in the south of Spain, probably can relate to this. They've had a pretty good life. They've got pensions that are coming through from the UK that are protected by the triple lock, but there is a worry. What sort of world are we passing on to our children and our grandchildren?
And if you look at, because again, we're kind of the same generation. I'm 57, so therefore we came of age politically in that period after Margaret Thatcher with her defeat of James Callaghan in 1979, and we're talking about bin bags in the streets and the dead being unburied, and here we are again. But the revolution that happened, and I mean that I'm a conservative with a small c, I'm revolution with a small r, that happened, is the fact that the power of the unions, for better or worse, and how you want to phrase that, was destroyed. People got this, it unleashed a creativity and positivity in business, and obviously the 80s, and we were there with our massive mobile phones and our red braces and our Ford XR3i convertibles. But there was suddenly, we had the years leading up to, the years of the 80s were a fantastic time for business. Britain was, the end of the 90s saw the Soviet Union collapse. Jacques Delors was doing things in the EU. Margaret Thatcher had the great transatlantic relationship with Ronald Reagan, which I don't think we've ever had a relationship so close since Churchill. It was a different time, but it was an exciting time to be a conservative with a small c.
I think that's right. One of the themes of my book is to, and I'm very proud of being English. I mean, my late mother was German. My father was in the British Army, and my parents met in the early 1960s when my father was serving out in Germany. And I'm very proud of being British. But I think we have to recognise that really, since the Second World War, and the contribution that we made to winning that war, but of course it was also financially a ruinous contribution, we have been in decline as a country, probably with the exception, as you've alluded to, of that period really, I say, bookended by two wars, the Falklands War in 82 and probably the Iraq War in 2003. But of course, that 20-year period of an uplift in the UK's fortunes reflected the first 2 decades of our adult life. And of course, we then saw that as being the norm when it hasn't really been the norm. So there are a lot of those themes that I've tried to bring up into the book, and it's just not all pessimistic. But I think one of the things we've got to get away from is this idea that Britain is exceptional, Britain rules the waves, etc. We are a brilliant country, but in the same way as, dare I say it, generations of Spaniards have had to take a view, or Portuguese have taken a view to say, well, actually, we had great empires at one time, but now we're medium-sized European nations. And that's, I think, what we have to do in the UK. And we've got, a great capital city. We've got, some great assets going for us. There is still a lot of innovation there, but we've got to make it a good place for youngsters to live in, because otherwise the brightest and best will head off. And again, you and I both remember what life was like as we were probably teenagers. There was all the talk of the brain drain of people being lost from our shores, particularly going to the US. And, one of the things, I was a businessman before I went into politics, and I left Parliament in 2019, and I've gone back into the sort of business world in sort of non-executive type roles. But one of the things that's very evident to me is there is still some real energy and excitement about the United States of America as a business place. We all know it's got some very dysfunctional politics. How this thing is going to play out in relation to tariffs and Donald Trump's second coming, who knows how that will play out in the next few months and years. And I think we're still at a very early stage of that. But there is still some sense of energy about America, which we've got to try to encapsulate, I think, in the UK.
But here's the thing, because it's very easy to criticize. It is very easy for us to go, well, it's millennials and Generation Z, and it's Britain is broken, it's not working. And, you're sitting there at the moment, Mark, and the Zoom seems to be working quite fine, and, you've got a clean shirt on, and the tie looks rather splendid. So we have to surmise.
I'm dressing up for the occasion.
Well,
I assumed it was going to be,
Obviously, I'm actually got, obviously you can tell I've got full ball gown underneath this. No, but seriously, but it's very easy to criticise and to knock and to go, oh well, the younger generation. And people have always said this. I mean, people in the 70s and said that the brave men and women who'd fought in the Second World War said that the generation who grew up in the 60s were sort of freebooters and the whole thing. So it's very easy to criticise the coming generation, but you make a couple of suggestions or a couple of pointers, as you said, because there is still creativity there in the UK.
I very much so. And I'm not, in many ways, I criticise my generation because I think we've had it the best of times, and, you have to pass it on. And the reality is, outside of wartime, it's probably unique that this generation says, well, the next generation are going to get a less good deal than we are. But there are some, as I say, there is creativity. I think our youngsters, those who are educated and are willing to work hard, will find tremendous opportunities in the world beyond. I guess the other thing, that again, unusually for our generation, is just that we were able to travel so much more extensively. And again, there's a bit of an evocative what life was like in the 1970s. The first time I ever stepped on an aeroplane, I was 19 years old. I mean, holidays, we had 4 overseas holidays when I was a youngster, and it was sort of car ferries out of Weymouth or Harwich to get to the continent or to the Channel Islands, and that was what life was like. And one shouldn't forget that we take for granted the opportunities of travel, of the international lifestyle. I mean, I'm sure some of your listeners will remember what it was like. You went to a greengrocer on a sort of Wednesday afternoon, and you got your fruit and vegetable in season. The idea that you should be able to get strawberries or anything 12 months of the year being flown from across the world was unknown in the 1970s and 1980s. So the whole attitude, and of course, technology has made a massive difference as well. And again, my children are bemused when I tell them that I grew up until my late teens and there were 3 TV channels, and of course we didn't have social media as the curse or benefit that we now see.
But you mentioned travel. I mean, you were in government during the most momentous period, obviously, which was you were with David Cameron's was running, and it was Brexit. And I remember because I was doing TV with with ITV that morning, and especially as somebody who regards himself as a European who grew up, as the EU was being always thought of himself as a European, and then the result comes through. It must have sent seismic shockwaves through where you were at the time. It certainly did in southern Spain and throughout Spain.
No,
and so
very much so. No, I very much so. Listen, you'll gather with European blood running through my veins, I was very much a Remainer, and really the reason I left Parliament, I mean, I was 55 in 2019, but the reason I left was because I couldn't support the party policy on Brexit, and particularly the hard Brexit that we ended up moving towards. And you're right to allude to the fact that this is the seismic issue of our generation, is leaving the European Union. And in many ways, I think it's exposed some of the vulnerabilities that the UK has got. We are now a medium-sized nation. We're not part of a bigger organisation with a single market, with a customs union of 450 million people, but we are on our own with 68 million people. And it was a real shock to me. I mean, to be fair, I obviously represented a central London seat where 72% of my voters were like me, were Remainers. And I must confess, I never thought for 1 minute that we were going to leave the EU. And then, I was there at the count as suddenly everything began to unfold. And in many ways, I think that the UK hasn't really been able to get used to the idea of what Brexit was about. And of course, it came at just the moment when, unfortunately, internationally, globalization became under much more threat, and the protectionism that came around with Donald Trump's first term. And people forget, that Biden was really, to a large extent, continuity of Trump, more than meets the eye. But obviously now in the second term of Trump, it's much more aggressive with all the tariffs that are being proposed. I mean, how that will play out over the next few months, I think, is open to question. But there's a lot of uncertainty going forward. And
not only that, though, we talk about seismic shocks, but you could argue, Mark, that there's a seismic shock around this time with Brexit, and then the thing that we do not mention that put us all in lockdown for 5 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
But also it changed the very nature of the Conservative Party and made it a capital C, and also to a certain extent to all the parties, because they became, having seen what happened across the pond, suddenly social media, which you alluded to before, has made arguments black or white, and you know better than anybody else that politics is about the shades of grey in between, and the politics of the tweet and the social media and the personality has taken over from the quiet and steady work that politics used to be about.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And, one of the complaints I have is that it has become so much more performative, and, without personalising it too much, but people like Boris Johnson are emerging on the scene, something of a cult hero still to this day to many Conservatives, but also much more slapdash, not looking at administration in a serious and sensible way. And Rishi Sunak was very hamstrung by what happened then. And, one of the things I do say, Keir Starmer was someone whom I knew from university days. And I was up at Oxford in the mid-'80s with all these sort of people, David Miliband, Boris Johnson, Jeremy Hunt. But I did know Starmer. We were actually at the same college together. He was a postgraduate in law when I was an undergraduate. And in many ways, his sort of kind of steady approach may yet win through. And maybe that is this sense of moving away from our own exceptionalism that we had. But you're right about, the whole COVID thing. I wasn't in Parliament at the time, but from the outset, my view was that we overreacted. We should have had a quarantine for the elderly and for the people who were obviously had major health conditions, but otherwise it should have been business as usual. And we got into this mindset of thinking, well, vast amounts of money could be spent on putting the economy into deep freeze, and we're still paying the price for that now.
When you went into politics, Mark, what was the driving force for it? Because the reason I'm going to ask this is because when you look at a current crop of people going to politics, you kind of think, are they in it for the long term? Because you're seeing people going into politics, having 4 years, losing a by-election, and then thinking, right, that's it, I'm off to do something else.
I think part of the issue, to be honest, is, of course, Giles, that everything's much more volatile. You look at the last two general elections, there have been this shift massively, so that there is no such thing as a safe seat anymore. The seat I represented had been Conservative, unbroken since 1880. So I must confess my first reaction on getting elected in 2001 was relief rather than joy. But now, here in 2024, it went Labour for the first time. So you can't... There is no sense of a safe seat or any sense that you enter politics and think, I'll be doing this for 30 or 35 years. But you're right. The other problem, and I say it as someone who was very proud. I became an MP at 36. I'd been an activist in the party, but I'd been a lawyer, then a businessman. I'd never worked in politics, and politics has now become a full-time professional with all these special advisors, lobbyists, researchers, think tankers. And I don't think that's been very healthy. And most of these people have got very little experience outside the world of politics, and in my view, don't necessarily add a lot when they become MPs. And when they leave, the first thing they do is get back on the bandwagon of being a lobbyist or a think tanker.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I hear a lot on the shows, the phone, is that we now have people in who are basically full-time politicians. They're not bringing a wealth of experience from the outside world.
Yeah.
So you're creating an echo chamber or something that's,
Yes.
and this feeds into a populist narrative of, the politicians, they're only after themselves, and what we need is a strong leader, and then we're all down that particular rabbit hole, Mark.
No, well, we are. And listen, I mean, one of I end my book really with a little look towards where the future is. And of course, what was weird about the last general election, and this astonishing set of results, was that Labour got 33.7% of the vote, which was normally be a losing percentage in vote share, and partly because it was seen as a bit of a foregone conclusion they were going to win. Their vote fell away in some of their safer seats. But nonetheless, they had this massive majority. And I think we could be now in a very, very uncertain political period. And, obviously, you've touched on it. Reform UK, Farage is there. Again, there's a sense of a plague on all your houses is sort of what his message is. The Tories have had 14 years, they've made a mess, and their brand is badly damaged and will be for some time. And that's why the subtitle of my book is in play. But Labour obviously have struggled far more quickly than many would have thought possible. So who knows what happens in the next election? We may have 4 parties with over 100 seats. And again, I wouldn't underestimate the Liberal Democrats making further progress from what is already a high point for them. But we could have 4 parties, all with 100 seats, no party getting more than barely a quarter of the vote. And it's a much more disparate political system. And, that comes with dangers. And as you say, we've seen it in quite a lot of mainland Europe, where populist right-of-centre parties really not even suggesting they're going to solve the problems, but just seen as being a vanguard for very disaffected voters who feel, we've had enough of all of the other parties. You might get those people getting into power. And I've seen it obviously in Germany with the AfD with over 20% of the vote. They may all be shunned at the moment, but what happens when they get 30% of the vote in the next election? Then suddenly, it may be very difficult for all parties just to close them out of government. And of course, it plays to the narrative of grievance, which is very much at the forefront of a lot of populist politics.
And also the book is a portrait of a parliament and political parties that function with exceptional characters. And I mean exceptional in quotes, I characters. So you've, people who are no longer like Nicholas Soames, for example, Beast of Bolsover, Kenneth Baker, these sort of people who are, because the political parties should be big enough to be broad churches. Yes. And however, at the moment, as you said before, it's all managed extremely carefully. Everybody says the same thing: stay on message, always stay on message. So perhaps your book looks at some of the little, the vignettes of a functioning parliament. It says adrenaline filled, and that's a curse if ever there was one. But you see what I'm saying? It's a look at, and that sort of system doesn't really exist at the moment because everybody's on message all the time.
I think you're right, big characters. One of the little anecdotes I put in my book is, it's often said, people will recall William Wilberforce was this MP for 30 or so years, never served as a minister, but had the one big issue that he pushed heavily on, which was, abolishing slavery. And it's often remarked in British politics today, oh, well, if William Wilberforce was an MP today, surely he'd be a major thing. I don't think he would. I think he'd be regarded as a bit of a crank who is off message, as you say, obsessive about one issue rather than going along with the flow, with how politics all plays out. So, I mean, listen, I had a fascinating time in political life. I don't regret doing it. But I do reflect at the end of my book, think, well, would I go into politics today? And I'm not sure necessarily I would. And you've alluded to some of the strains and pressures that MPs are under. And I know that there's not a lot of sympathy for members of parliament. They bring it on themselves to a certain extent. But I think social media has made a massive difference. And funnily enough, I was very keen. As soon as I came out of politics, I came off all social media. And of course, now I've got a book to promote. I've had to go back onto doing TV and radio and stuff like that. And yes, I've quite enjoyed it. And hopefully I'm reasonably good at it. But by the same token, I haven't missed it. I must confess, being a private citizen after being in the stress and strain of political life is something that is quite a relief at sometimes.
Yes, Sunday mornings must be blissful for you after.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. I do remember often you'd be waiting and keeping an eye on your phone on the middle of a Saturday afternoon for the Sunday morning journalists who might get in touch about a particular story, and there'd be a sense of relief if you could go to bed and think, well, I'm not going to be in the papers here, there and everywhere. But no, I mean, it is relentless. And listen, to be honest, it's a world that our children and grandchildren fully understand. I mean, they're on their machines, as I say, 24/7. It's a different sort of world to the one that we grew up in.
What are you hoping that people will take from the end of an era?
Well, I hope people will enjoy the book. It's a bit of a period piece, as I say, about what life was like in the 70s and 80s, as well as obviously my own memoir. And, for me, I mean, I say I've got children, and I was a moderately prominent politician, but never reaching the highest ranks. But I hoped it's something that I could pass on to them, that they would have a sense of my being a footnote in history. I hope I've told a story in a fairly amusing and not overly racy way, but I've had interesting things that I've been through, but also make some comments about how politics has changed, and also some pointers for the future.
The book is called The End of an Era, The Decline and Fall of the Tory Party. Wonderful front cover, by the way. It is by Mark Field, who we're speaking to today. Mark, if people want to follow you online and say nice things to you, or they want to say really interesting things to you, where's the best place to find you on their social media?
That's very sweet of you to say so. Listen, I'm on my social media tag is Right Mark Field. I'm on X. I'm on LinkedIn, and obviously, do feel free to get in touch there. I'm afraid some of the more modern things like TikTok and Instagram are slightly beyond me, and hopefully beyond many of your listeners. But as I say, Right Mark Field is my social media tag, and it would be lovely to get in touch. And I do hope some of your readers might, or your listeners might become readers of my book, because, as I say, I think it tells an interesting story. I must confess I've enjoyed writing it and have been very honoured and pleased by the reception it's received so far.
And if you want to order it, just go to the TRE bookshop. There is a picture of the front page of the front cover. Just click on the front page of End of an Era, and you'll be able to order it online. The book is called End of an Era. It's by Mark Field. Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
That's really sweet of you. Lovely to speak to you, and all the very best. And I'm very envious of your son out in Marbella. So have a lovely rest of the day when you escape from the studio.